You say that this is more than a cookbook. How would you describe the book?
I describe it as a narrative cookbook because it takes you on a journey and a story. It also gives you an insight into how how incredible the Caribbean is, how the people are so layered and how much depth there is. And maybe it's a microcosm of the Caribbean itself in terms of the fact that it's like a story about my family, but then talking about the resilience, the hardships, the sadness and stuff we've experienced, but then the joy that also then comes from that. And then that being one of the stories that exists for the Caribbean itself.
This is the Moorish podcast where Caribbean history meets culture and cuisine. Hello, Marie. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Moorish podcast.
Thanks for having me. Hello.
I'm so excited to talk to you today about one of my favorite topics, food, and specifically Caribbean food. But before we dive right into the conversation, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm a chef, writer, and an author. I use food as a way to talk about much wider conversations about culture, history, politics, economics, because I really do believe that breaking bread is a really good way to have bigger, heartier conversations. So yeah, that's me.
I read your book, I made a bunch of notes, and then when I was rereading it, I added something that I wanted to ask you about, which is the very first lines in your book. It's a new year, and I'm staring out at the Caribbean Sea, feeling closer to the home I hold in my imagination than in a long time. These last 2 years, I've felt lost, detached from myself. Here in Grenada, though, I've been able to find pockets of me that I thought were gone. And that really stuck out to me because you open with such a powerful statement and you continue to, throughout this book, have very powerful emotional statements. So
Oh,
I'd like to
thank you.
start with that opening and where you were at that time.
I was in Grenada. It was the last place we were staying in while we were shooting some of the books. So just very classically me, in terms of how I work. The fact that we were in Grenada shooting some of the kind of more scenic photographs that feature throughout the book. And the book hadn't actually been completely finished yet. I think it says so much, but I'd been really struggling with kind of starting the essays. And I remember sitting on this veranda and I was looking out at the sea, and I just went to my phone, I've got it, and ran and got my phone and just sort of wrote this bit down because I was sitting in a hammock and my legs were dangling. I think at the time my daughter might have been asleep. And so I was just looking and I was just really thinking about my legs and kind of the mental and physical weight that they've been carrying, but then thinking about paths and people and how we sort of forged, and just very, very physically kind of what we carry, and then metaphorically what we carry. And then I was just thinking about the fact that it had been nearly 2 years, or just about 2 years, since my mum had passed away. And the last time that I'd spent any lengthy time with her was in Grenada, because that was just before the pandemic happened. And her last year of life was 2020, which was during the pandemic. So we didn't see a lot of each other because at the time I got pregnant kind of midway through, and she had to isolate because she had sickle cell and lupus, and because I was being careful because I was pregnant. So we just didn't get to see a lot of each other that her last year. And I think in being in the Caribbean, even though her heritage, or mum and dad's, both their heritage is Jamaican, they were both born there, being in the Caribbean, being back in this space that they, even if it wasn't their home as such, there was a connection. There was this link, this forging, this understanding, one of togetherness, of being physically at this place that I sort of created my new family in terms of getting married to my husband, But then that last time that we all spent this kind of 2 weeks together for this very life-changing time, and being there, I was just looking out, and I genuinely did feel like as though I was connected back with a time and a place and with an energy that had been missing for quite some time.
You experienced some loss in your life prior to writing this book, and you talk about the passing of your brother Richard, and it encouraging you to really connect with your heritage.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, after we lost Richie, I think as a family, we were lost for quite some time. And I think when I started the supper club and asked my dad to cook, it was just so mum that she was like, I want to be a part of it. Can I be a part of it too? So with having her host, this thing that was new and fresh and kind of exciting kind of became an opportunity for us to reconnect, I suppose. And in doing that, it kind of started around the time that I turned 30, which is actually nearly 10 years ago. It was 10 years ago the other day. I'm on the eve of turning 40, so it feels like lots of big things happen at these junctures. And I had really started to think about kind of who I was. I suppose the identity question was coming up, and trying to understand who you are outside of family or friends, just really kind of bedding down in terms of that question. And Richard had always been very self-assured in a way that I probably hadn't been. And one of the things that he was always very, very connected to, which we both were, but I suppose him being older and I mean, we're just different personalities, but his Caribbeanness was very tied to mum and dad, but also there was just a way in which he expressed it that I adored. And so in wanting to understand who I was, I suppose I wanted to really understand my Caribbean heritage, because my Britishness exists because I live here. I was brought up here. But in terms of my Caribbean, that's the part that so much has been absorbed through osmosis, through whether that be family or friends, or being, as I've got older, spending more time in the Caribbean. But what I loved was just this ability to kind of tap into an essence of what Richard massively personified through food, and understanding how he managed to hold those parts of his identity with these expressions in these recipes, or the things that mum and dad had cooked for him, and then bringing that into my own kind of understanding of identity, if that makes any sense.
It does. I mean, it's such a great thing that he passed along to you, and it continues to share with you, even though he's not physically with you anymore.
Yeah.
This identity and sense of self.
Yeah. And I'm really grateful for that, because I think I really wanted both my mum and my brother to be felt in the pages of the book, because they're not with me. And for those that know them, they can really feel them in there. So I sort of feel as if that legacy has been held onto and safeguarded within those pages, which to me is, yes, it's great when people read the book, and actually it does keep reaching further and wider, and it's far beyond my wildest dreams for what I could have imagined for it. But the very basis of it was that I just really, really wanted something that captured my family, and for me to have a physical manifestation of that, and that was achieved. So, no matter what, I'm like, the job is done.
The job is done. In those opening pages, your family comes through in your words, in your photos. It very much sets the tone for the book.
Thank you.
And talking about family, you said earlier your parents were both Jamaican, but they left Jamaica at an early age. So they didn't spend that many years of their formative years in Jamaica before they moved.
Yeah, they both moved when they were 8.
And they moved to the same...
London.
They both moved to London.
Yeah, both South London, not that far apart.
In some ways, and some people would say, your Caribbeanness is even more diluted because your parents moved to London at a very early age.
Mm.
But let's talk about that identity and what Caribbean cultural identity meant to you as you were growing up.
I think it was just in my head. It was just my family. I was just like, oh yeah, that's just who we are. I suppose I probably didn't think of it as a separate part of my identity. It's only as you get older and you're, I suppose, defining yourself on your own terms that then you start probably exploring. And I don't think everyone does this. I think if you come from a diaspora community or, global ethnic majority community who has moved away and there's a separation from what we define as home, I think then that's probably when you start questioning and trying to understand it, because there's a part of yourself, I suppose, that's always, I mean, or maybe not everyone feels it, but I suppose there was a part of myself that I felt was missing, that I wanted to understand with far more depth and real investigation and authority, I suppose. For me, my parents were always very deeply Caribbean. And I suppose when they probably moved to the UK, they would have moved during a time when, in terms of who they associated with, of course, like at school, their communities were more diverse. They end up meeting because they grew up on an estate in South London in Earlsfield. And so many of the communities were there. Yes, there were lots of Caribbean communities, but there were also just other communities that they knew and grew with and from. But I suppose fundamentally, when they initially moved here, everyone that they would have associated with was Caribbean. So even though they weren't there, there was this real strength of identity. And mum and dad both remember very specific things. Like my dad recalls being absolutely confused as to why they were in this cold, dark place where he was used to colour and sunshine and warmth, and really not understanding the food. And like my dad has really vivid memories around this. And actually my mum, particularly when we were in Grenada in 2019, she spoke about the fact that she was eating fruits and just like, oh my God, I remember this as a child. So I can understand the conversation about dilution, but I actually think there were formative years that were there. I think maybe had they come, I know that for siblings that were slightly younger, there's a greater detachment. But I think for them, there was this real understanding of like they were always Jamaican first and British second. And so much of their upbringing really is very layered in Britishness. And I think in many ways there's a discussion about the indoctrination personally that does exist, particularly for that kind of generation, because there was so much about the crown and about being British as a Commonwealth country that for my generation, there's a much more comfortable detachment from that, that I don't think my parents were necessarily afforded, because so much of it was about belonging and assimilation. And I think that's where the dilution comes from, in that there was an assumption or a way in which they were made to feel that they had to be a part of something, and to be a part of that, they had to be a very strict type of person. Now, personally, both my parents didn't conform to that in all the ways. My mum was a massive royalist, so she did in others. But I really think that they were truly Caribbean first. And that's probably why I hadn't necessarily felt as if I'd missed anything for such a long time, because when I'd go to my aunts, when I'd go to my nans or my other grandparents, there was this sense of belonging and understanding, but there wasn't something you needed to have an explanation from. It was just how we existed. And I just thought that was quite beautiful. But of course, it was a version of, because it was a diaspora community.
It's an interesting conversation that I've had with many people, some who have the same feeling as you do, and some who say if you didn't grow up in the Caribbean, then you don't really understand it. And I was born and raised in Toronto. My parents moved to Canada shortly before I was born. And I understand that there is a difference between growing up in Trinidad versus growing up in Toronto, but that doesn't mean that that Caribbean Trinidadian identity doesn't still reside as part of who I am.
Yeah. As you said, there's 100% a difference in terms of my experiences versus those that are from the Caribbean. And for me, I approach it with curiosity. So for me, I'm always trying to ask questions to understand how I can bridge that conversation so that it doesn't feel as if I'm going there and being extractive, because then that actually speaks to colonialism, and that's not something I want to be a part of. But the other side of that is that where does it get us if we constantly want to remove the fact that you're connected? And so I approach it with curiosity, because I'm very much wanting to try and find that bridge or that connection for how we can understand those both of our experiences, but ultimately for me to feel, not even for me to feel, but for there to be an understanding that we're both embedded in a history and a conversation together. And then what I sometimes like to think about is, by kind of talking about the fact that I'm removed in a negative connotation, what does that do to try and create a conversation for us to try and figure out ways in which we can work as a unit or in tandem with each other to try and create differences and growth? Because fundamentally, the things that I would love to see for the Caribbean, I would hope, are the same things that Caribbeans want to see for themselves. And there's definitely a real conversation to be had about the fact that being here, there is an element of privilege that I have had access to. And so it's really important for me that when I do go there, that I'm conscious of the fact that I approach everything with curiosity, and I'm there as a student, not as someone and as authority, and supporting in how the people, the communities want to exist there. But also to do that in a way that genuinely is supportive and really wants to see change. I don't really want to be someone who is over here just doing all the talking, but then not trying to figure out ways in which I can support the community. And so I think it's very much embedded in being like, how can I put the power in your hands so that it isn't basically just only extractive or extractive at all, as much as possible. And that's why I think when I talk about the work that I do, of course it's layered in an understanding or in culture, but also being very conscious of the fact that there is a difference between what I'm doing here and what I would be doing there. But I'm always trying to honour as much as I'm able to, in being laid in respect for the place in which I know that my history comes from.
All of what you just said really comes through in your book. And I encourage people, when they get a copy of it, to
Yes.
read those beginning pages, because I think a lot of this sentiment, a lot of this feeling comes through in those beginning pages, and also through the book in the story that you tell before each recipe. The care that you take to share the knowledge, share some history, share some information. It's not just a cookbook chock full of recipes.
Oh, honestly, you really hope that people read the book and take from it what you're trying to give. But ultimately, once it's out in the world, people interpret it however they're going to. So sort of hearing that level of care, detail and respect is fully layered and is being interpreted in that way, actually does make me quite emotional, because it's like you have a goal. You have a goal and you really hope that that's what you achieve. And for that to have actually happened is quite magical, because there can often be barriers sometimes to making that happen, particularly in the world of publishing. And I was lucky, and I don't like the fact that I was lucky in my experience, because I think that should be the experience that everyone has. But I'm aware of the fact that this isn't necessarily everyone's experience. So it feels quite incredible to know that what I set out to achieve many years ago has actually gone off into the world. And
When you say you were lucky, what does that mean? Tell me about that.
I'm lucky. There's a couple of things here. I think as a Black female author, we know that our work is absolutely desired. It is bought. It is appreciated. But fundamentally, I think the Caribbean particularly is still very much an under-researched, a lack of understanding in terms of how rich, layered the culture is. And I think in many ways, there's a part of that is maybe done by design sometimes, I think, when I think about it, because though there were experiences of colonization and slavery that existed before that, that particular period in time caused such intense growth, particularly in Europe, but really also in North America as well, that not contending with it is a history that people would probably prefer to ignore. So there's a surface understanding. And then I think because of that, maybe there's a lack of understanding how accessible much of the Caribbean culture and cuisine is. And then I think in terms of just like being, as I said, a Black female author, the publishing industry, we know that there's a massive stripping back of Black authors being supported. That wasn't my experience, but I do know that that does exist. But then equally, just sometimes without those additional layers, some publishing experiences are just not necessarily the most collaborative. And with that means then you're not being supported in your vision. And I suppose, being lucky was that I chose this one. There are a few choices and I chose this one. I chose it because there was such excitement for the work. And my editor at the time was extremely experienced, but also has become such a close friend. I'm actually having lunch with him tomorrow. And there was an alignment. There was alignment in that there was an understanding of my vision and a real excitement and drive to bring it to life. And that's where I think I talk about the luckiness, because I think sometimes visions can be moved or reshaped because of the fact that it might make sense from a commercial perspective, that people have an understanding. But I was very passionate about how I wanted it to be from every tiny detail in that book. Everyone that was involved was incredible. And there were many conversations that were had in terms of what we wanted to bring to light. But the fact that everyone involved really wanted to make that happen, and it was an incredibly collaborative process, is where I feel like I had probably one of the best experiences that I could have been afforded, to be perfectly honest.
I've been fortunate enough to speak to 3 different authors of Caribbean cookbooks, all women. And I think based on the 3 conversations, it sounds like you had, quote unquote, the easiest time, because somebody else said the question came up, how many Caribbean cookbooks can there be or should there be? And the answer is
Endless.
It doesn't matter. Infinite.
Exactly. Do you know what I mean? It's like the same question that we should have for every other cuisine that we have. I think one of the best quotes I ever heard, or was a conversation with a friend where she'd been reading something, and fundamentally she was like, the reason why there's this sort of drive or idea that French cuisine is sort of seen as a pinnacle is because someone basically wrote it down. So much of in terms of global ethnic majority, so much of our history and our recipes are passed down orally. And that's the difference. That is the main difference. If we had written it down, maybe it would have been this. I mean, I think there's other intersects and they would have probably had some involvement in that. No, maybe not being the case. But fundamentally, when we really want to strip it back, someone wrote those things down. They were like, right, these are the mother sources, and then these are the daughter sources that come from that. You know what I mean? That's basically, if we're really simplifying it, that's what happened. And so I think it's so painfully reductive when we have that conversation of, oh, how many can there be? And I'm like, well, we all have a unique voice. We all have a different story to tell. If we can have 20 different or 30,000 or however many books on cookies or bread making or Italian cuisine or French cuisine, then we can have the exact same for the Caribbean. And if we look at the fact that the representation is already skewed, then we can have even more. It's a huge region. A huge region. We have barely even scratched the surface. So we can absolutely have limitless possibilities. And it's really, it's infuriating to realize that that's, and I know that's not a unique experience and solely only from Caribbean. I know that that's the experience for a lot of other, I suppose, marginalized communities. I don't like using that word because I always want, I'm very much in an era of my life where I'm trying to stand in power. And so it's using words that allow us to feel that. So it's not just kind of, if we don't necessarily believe it, if you keep saying it, it becomes true. Do you know what I mean? And so it's frustrating to realize that is, I know it's the truth, but it's always upsetting to hear.
I had a conversation with Keisha Valens, who wrote Culinary Colonialism. So a look at the early cookbooks from the Caribbean and the early food. And one of the things that you said is much of the knowledge of recipes and cooking was passed down orally. And in this conversation that I had with her, she points out that many of the early Caribbean cookbooks were actually written by Europeans who
Yeah.
were trying to write down the recipes of food that was being cooked for them.
Mm.
And so if you look back in history at some of these cookbooks, you're not actually getting, in my opinion, the true food. You're getting a version of written by people who probably never made any of the recipes themselves.
Yeah. I've definitely, when doing some of my research, that's something that came up, and even in terms of a lot of the history books as well. Like, a lot of them are written by white people, and that's not to say that there isn't a place for that, and that there isn't space for people that have basically really spent time and energy in these places to understand and to share that culture. That's not it at all. But it says a lot, the fact that the opportunities in to kind of get these things down and to share this was centered around Europeans.
Yeah. Your book, Kin, Caribbean Recipes for the Modern Kitchen. So I have a couple of questions about this. Why did you choose to write a book about the entire Caribbean and not just one island, one country?
So, I mean, as I said, it's still so much more, it's so vast and there's still so much more to touch on. But I suppose what I wanted to do was talk about what my experience of Caribbean cuisine was to that point. And so the recipes that feature in there they are heavily Jamaican because that is my experience. And I think when it probably would have been more broad. So there were things that were taken out that would have, that will find its way into other cookbooks. But for this one, it definitely became more of a legacy project. So for me, it really felt important to include the things of my family because I wanted that to be present. But then the additional recipes that feature are ones that I've had experience with, either people that I have loved, that I do love, or places that I've been to. And I wanted to capture that. So, I mean, to try and even touch on the vastness was never going to be something that I was going to be able to do in one book. But for me, the recipes, the reason why I've done those was because of the fact that I was like, this is how I got into doing this. And these are the exposures that I've had to this point. And then every book that will follow from that will be another experience and another journey into another part of what I'm trying to discover. And I think also because the fact, with the title, it gives it away in many respects. Yes, this is about my family, but it's also about how we relate to each other as Caribbeans, and understanding that we are individuals and we have our nuances and differences in the different islands, but that we are kin. And I will probably say this until the day I die, but we are so much stronger together. And the more that we can recognize and realize that, then we are able to stand in our power. So that's the reason why I wanted to touch on a few places. Not enough, but I wanted to touch on a few because it's the exposure and the experiences I've had with people from some of those places, whether that's diaspora communities or direct access in some of the places I visited, and wanted that to feature.
And what do you mean by the modern kitchen?
I knew that one was coming. We always need a subtitle. I think for me, what I mean by it is that these are recipes you can cook every day. Not every single recipe is an everyday recipe, but I really want people to understand in a modern context that Caribbean cuisine can sit right there next to other European cuisines that we will cook in abundance without even second guessing. And so that's what I meant by that subtitle, is that this is food for everyone on any day, and it should absolutely feature in your rotations.
There are recipes in your book that are easier to make and some that are a little bit more complex. And there's a time and a place for everything. And
Exactly.
much like our families are growing up, for me, the weekends were when those more complex recipes were made for the big Sunday lunch or
Exactly.
the weekend. And then the easier ones were made during the week.
Mm. Yeah.
There's an interesting thing with from family to family, from country to country, region to region, you might have the same recipe being made slightly differently.
Yes.
And so following a recipe book gives you, from, in my opinion, a starting point to learn the recipes, learn the flavors, and then you can branch out if you find other ingredients that you want to include or other techniques that you want to include. But it's a really great beginning to the culture and to the food of the place.
It is, yeah. That's very much what I want this to be, is that I'm giving you the context and the history if you want to tap into it, which I really hope people do. It's woven in different ways. And the essays, if you want to have it a little bit meatier, but even with the recipe introductions, like it's there to give you a little bit of a snippet. But I wanted this to be a framework. And I think that's the reason why maybe other cuisines have become things that we will cook, because we have been exposed to it for longer. And so then we've had a longer chance to understand the framework. And that, I suppose, I was thinking about it as scaffolding. We're just going to keep building on our knowledge and our experience. So this is something where you're like, okay, I don't have much knowledge, so let me try this recipe. Okay, that was actually really accessible. Let me try another one. Or my family prefers it like this, so I'm actually going to adjust it for our taste or for our palate. Do you know what I mean? I think that's kind of what I really wanted this book to be. And also for those who do have an understanding of the cuisine, but for whatever reason, they've not cooked it, or they didn't manage to capture recipes from their own family. And so we can cook it. And then, oh, I now kind of understand what my granddad, grandma, mum or dad was doing. And then being able to experiment to be like, if I add a little bit of this, oh my gosh, that tastes just like how they used to make it. So it's kind of twofold. It's for those that don't know, and then also for those that have some experience to then get additional, especially for those that haven't always been able to be exposed to it, because not all families, there's a lot of gatekeeping that does exist. And so, it's like to kind of give people access. And that's kind of where it came from in many ways, because, you know, I would ask my dad and I would just have to watch with detail because they don't write anything down. And actually, I do find like when I'm recipe writing, I will quite often just kind of do things in instinct, and I'm like, oh God, I've got to try and remember and write these details down. And honestly, most of the recipes, they've been tested many times, and I made sure that I really wanted to make sure that they worked. But when I'm cooking them myself, I don't follow it. I'll look at it and be like, oh yeah, I forgot. Oh yeah. And then I'll just add a whole load of extra of this or a little bit more of that, because it's like, what do I have in the fridge? And also what have I got available? So I really want it to be that fun. I want it to be pleasurable. I want it to be enjoyable. I don't want it to be something that becomes too prescriptive. But I do want you to be able to have the opportunity to get that context and understanding, while also being able to build on your knowledge base.
Every single one of us who's tried to learn a recipe from moms, grandmothers, aunties, uncles know that they will say, you stir it until it looks like this. Or when you say, how much of this spice do I put in? It's generally they'll put it in their hand and say, about this much.
Yes.
And I don't know what about this much means. So looking in a book
Yes.
gives a really great starting point. If anybody's out there who's had that experience of not being able to write down recipes from people in their family, a cookbook is a really great way to get started. And also to preserve the recipes, because cultures and people and how foods are made are always changing and adapting and growing. And as populations change, as ingredients become more readily available, as different techniques emerge, then we start to see a different variation on some of these foods. And so a book like yours, for example, sort of preserves place and time.
Yeah.
So 10 years from now, I might open your book and say, oh, well, somebody makes this soup now very differently, but this is what it was made like 10 years ago.
And that's really beautiful. The idea that you're capturing a moment in time. That's fun. You know, that is what is happening. I think, because I felt very passionate about I first started cooking, I was like, everything has to be very traditional. And I think that was because I was trying to understand it. And that's probably where that came from. I think my cooking now versus even 2 or 3 years ago, maybe even a year ago, has massively shifted because there's an element of, I think, me allowing myself to be more experimental. I'm still honouring, I'm still understanding, but actually, I've been doing it longer now where I'm allowed, it's not even allowed, I feel comfortable in being more playful and maybe not always being quite as traditional. Maybe it's like the nod to, rather than being like, I'm going to do this exactly as that. It's like playing around with what the ingredients can do and how I can experiment with them, which is a really fun place to be, actually.
This book isn't your first foray into the food space. And you talked earlier about the pop-up that you had with your parents, and it was a supper club.
Yes,
is that correct?
Yeah, Pop's Kitchen.
And then this led to Island Social Club, supplying thousands of customers with rum and roti. So tell me about this.
Yeah, so I started my supper club in 2016 with my dad helping me in the kitchen and mum helping me host, which was wonderful. And then probably about 8 months in, I met Joseph, who was running a rum pop-up with his cousin Biko. And we started collaborating together. So they would curate a rum menu, punches and things to run alongside the food. And eventually we figured out it just made sense to kind of work together because we were definitely on a similar pathway of trying to understand our identity through our own lens and research. And then Island Social Club was born. It took a little bit longer than just how quickly I'm saying it. But we kind of had the chance to do a couple of different residencies, so like longer term restaurant residencies at the same time. So one was actually a street food site, and then one was this. And in the street food site, we started doing roti, and that we really noticed that is something we really wanted to explore. And we then got a chance to have like a restaurant residency for a year, which is then when we were supplying lots of people, thousands of people, with rum and roti, which was incredible. I have to say, it was extremely challenging and eye-opening to run a restaurant. Neither of us had worked in hospitality before, so it was quite an extreme learning curve, which I look back on with fondness. It was really tough at times, but the amount of knowledge and experience, and also just like this huge energy that kind of came from that, was amazing. And I think for us, which is probably the way in which I like to engage with my work even now, is that we wanted to kind of profile and highlight other parts of the cuisine that maybe don't get as much of a place. Being Jamaican, I'm very aware that so much of what we experience as Caribbean is actually Jamaican, or through the lens of Jamaica. And of course, I'm a massive fan of Jamaica. It's, it has my heart. But there are other places, and we wanted to explore that. And so that's why we decided to focus on roti. And so we spent a good year doing a lot of research and recipe testing and retesting to kind of nail the roti recipe, and then bringing that to the people. And it was incredible. There was such a space for it. And I really think, I don't know if it's the same in Toronto, but certainly here, I think a lot of the time you either have quite high-end places or you have the takeaway joints, but that kind of middling space, there's just not as much of that. And that definitely sat there, which is why I think it was really well engaged with, because of the fact that you could go and have really good quality food. Provenance has always been really important to me and will continue to be. But then equally, it's like really relaxed. There wasn't this sense of rigidity or anything like that. You could just go and have a really good time. So yeah, that was Island Social Club, which was amazing.
When you say roti, what roti are you talking about?
What do I mean? I'm talking about bus up shut roti.
So this has been really eye-opening for me, is that question of what does roti mean to you? Because I've started asking people that question on the podcast or as I encounter them in life, and the answer changes from person to person. So I talked to somebody else, roti for her is dal puri. Roti for my other friend, bus up shut. Roti for me is sada roti. So it's interesting.
Oh, I do love sada roti. Oh, so good.
So it's interesting that one word that we use means something different to so many different people.
And what's beautiful is it's bread. but yet still this bread means different. And I think just the absolute basis of what it is for us, but then also the way in which that fundamental bread, flour, water, maybe some sort of leavening agent, but then also maybe a bit of salt, maybe a bit of sugar, how that plays out around other cultures and cuisines as well. So there's this idea of roti for us, but then the way in which that plays out around culture is just incredible. Like the simplicity of what you can do with this flour, this grain, and how then that is interpreted and becomes this other thing. But just, for me, it's that tangibility, just, oh God, now I want roti.
I'll tell you, the art of making roti looks, when you watch someone do it, it doesn't look that complicated. And I'm talking about any kind of roti.
Yeah.
It doesn't look that complicated, but once you start to try it, I'll tell you that I've never successfully made a good roti in my life.
Really? Okay, you've got to try the recipe and then message me and I'll send you some tips because we need to make this happen.
It is, and I think sada roti is probably the easiest, in my opinion, to make.
Yeah.
But it's such a technique to learn.
It is. And it's funny because I think I've done a few classes and things and often will teach roti because I think it is, one, it's really interactive, which is so fun. And I think just like people seeing it, it's really fun. But I also know it's probably one of the hardest things to get right. So having the opportunity to be in space with people, you know, actually in community and standing there and being able to like, right, this is kind of how you do it and going through that is lovely because I'm able to then show them like this is the beginning of your journey, but also recognizing, that is a skill that has been practiced and then I've grown. Like the roti I used to make 5 years ago versus the roti I make now, and just the way in which I'll be like, no, that's not quite right, and I can actually be, oh, maybe that the milk was too hot there, or oh no, that needs more kneading, or actually just let that rest because it's smooth, but it's, even though it's still a bit firm, actually just letting the gluten relax. Like the knowledge that has been acquired from just spending time making it again and again and again. You know, I love that. And like what my roti will be like now versus in another 5 years, you know, as I start to also build on what roti means and what other rotis I can then learn and master. That's something that I really enjoy. So the next book might have more roti recipes. And it's nice, the idea that then what the roti means to me will grow and change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, roti is one of those dishes or recipes that cannot be rushed. To make a good roti, you just need sometimes to just allow it to rest.
Exactly, which is a really beautiful lesson in just food in general. Sometimes it's like, you know, we spoke about those recipes that are for later in the week or a Sunday. You know, it's for those days when we don't want to be in a rush. And there's a lot of beauty in that and taking your time.
On the cover of your book, you have the Sankofa bird, and that's purposeful.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
I think I probably saw the Sankofa symbol for the first time probably like 6 or 7 years ago and was really drawn to it. And I still am. Every time I see a version of it, I'm always just like, it just speaks to me. And when we were editing one of the essays, I was speaking about the Sankofa and I just made a note to my editor and was like, I think this should be the cover of the book. Because I just had this really strong image, because so much of what I'm talking about is how our past is informing our present and our future. And the Sankofa is essentially a symbol that personifies that. And for me, I just thought it would be an incredible, powerful image that is often associated with Black resistance and strength and resilience. And so to be able to put that on the cover of a book about food, which is also about strength and power and resistance and resilience, really, for me, I was just like, if this can actually happen, like, it's actually quite incredible. And because I think a lot of the time, there's something about it doesn't make it look like it's in a cookbook, which it is, but it is more than that. And so I think from the moment when you look at that book, you're like, there's more in here. And it's able to kind of showcase that. Though a lot of the time people are like, oh, the chicken. I'm like, it's not a chicken. And that's why I was like, we need to put the explanation of what it is really early in the book. So actually people are like, okay, it's not chicken eat an egg. It's like, no. There's more going on here.
You say that this is more than a cookbook. How would you describe the book?
I describe it as a narrative cookbook because it takes you on a journey and a story. And it's more than a cookbook because ultimately, if you just want to open it and cook good recipes that we can absolutely nail without any issue, you can do that. But it also gives you an insight into how incredible the Caribbean is, just how the people are so layered and how much depth there is, and also just an understanding of, you know, this little family from South London and how they've had an influence on others and myself, and being able to just share that with people. It's like maybe it's a microcosm of the Caribbean itself in terms of the fact that it's like a story about my family, but then like talking about the resilience, the hardships, the sadness and stuff we've experienced, but then the joy that also then comes from that, and then that being one of the stories that exists for the Caribbean itself.
I made multiple notes while reading your book, and this quote sort of goes along with what you're saying, which is the depth and complexity of our cultural history is evident in our food. But while that complexity can't be ignored, it remains widely misunderstood. And our food seems a mystery to some or to many. And I feel like that really sums up so much of what we've been talking about. Is the food is not just the food and the recipes, but there's a whole complex history that goes along with almost every single dish that you've written about in this book.
Yeah. And it's just it's woven in. And I just think I really want people to appreciate that. And I think that's why when you eat it, and maybe that's why people are, there's sort of a misunderstanding about it, because of the fact that maybe when you eat it, certainly there is so much complexity. And without maybe having an understanding of it or having cooked it, you'll think that that's something that is beyond what you're able to do, and it's not. It's just knowing that, just engaging in it, and you realise that that's just, those layers are woven in because it's just like extra spices. You've got the fresh, you've got the dry spices, you've got the pickles and the fruitiness and the sourness and just the heat, all of those things interwoven together that kind of create this dance that is like a melody that you get to experiment with.
The name of this podcast is the Moorish Podcast. Do you know what that word means, Moorish?
In my head, I assumed it was when you're wanting more, because it's Moorish.
Yes. It is a word that I grew up knowing is specifically around food. If you're eating something really delicious, it's Moorish because you want more. And that gesture that you made is what I make when I talk about it. And interestingly enough, I don't know if it's used just in Trinidad, and that's why I know it, but it's not a word I've learned through this podcast and through many guests that many people in the Caribbean know. And
really,
in more research, it is very much a British term.
Okay. Because I was going to say, I use it all the time, but yeah, okay.
I think that's why you would probably know it. Any place that had British colonialism might know it. I think that's probably why I know it in Trinidad, but maybe not widely known all across the Caribbean.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
See, I love when you do these things and you're like, I just learned something new.
I'm learning something new all the time from the guests that I have on this podcast, and it's opening my eyes to different experiences, different people, the different lenses through which they view culture and heritage. And all of it shows me that in the Caribbean, we are kin and we have similar ancestries and similar histories. But for every single person, it is unique and it's interpreted differently.
Exactly. And that's the beauty. That is the beauty. We just all get to see it with different eyes.
Before we wrap up, you have so many other things going on, and I want to make sure that if people want to connect with you, where can they reach you?
I only laugh because people always like, oh, you up to? And I'm like, oh, not very much at the moment. And then I say things and they're like, you're so busy. But in my head, I don't think I am. That's why I laugh. You can mostly find me on Instagram. It's Marie_Mitchell_. Or my website, which is mariemitchell.co.uk, or my Substack, which I'm finally going to start writing more frequently, which is Slow Rituals. All linked from my Instagram.
And I will leave links in the show notes to all of these so people can connect with you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You are more than a cookbook author. You're more than somebody who runs pop-ups and events. You started this conversation with the lens through which you approach food. And I'm going to read a little line from your bio that you are a cultural practitioner who works with words and food, adopting a considered approach to discuss social and political themes in spaces of nourishment. As we close off, can you tell us what that means?
It means that I create spaces, whether that be through conversation or whether that be through the food that I pour time, energy, and love into, that are nourishing. This is a more recent bio that I've really thought about because I genuinely, it's probably come from feedback, but also from my own desire to put in the world spaces of nourishment, but particularly through the lens of either what I'm able to give you in terms of food on a table or standing, but just from the inside out, or through conversation that then you can take away and think about. But both of those are centered around nourishment.
Marie, I thank you for taking the time to join me today on the podcast. We've really just scratched the surface of the book and some of the other work. But again, I'm going to leave all of the links in the show notes for people to continue to follow the work that you're doing and engage, because I think this conversation is more than the food, as you've just mentioned. There's so many layers, and I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that as time passes, you're going to be sharing more and more as you uncover more and more in your own life.
Yeah, 100%. I'm on a journey, and I'm on a journey where it's a personal thing. So I always talk about my work as selfish in many ways because I do this because I'm desperate to know more. But where it moves from being selfish is then I share that with people, and hopefully as time goes on, more and more people are interested. So yeah, but thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really beautiful.
Thanks for joining me for today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast. It really does help getting the podcast and our Caribbean stories in front of more people. See you for the next episode.